It was deep night at the station. The North Junction station was practically deserted. The sparse lights flickered dimly under the iron roof, and the empty platforms gave off a chill that penetrated to the bone. Anton, a young journalist, was traveling to a small northern village to write an article about its disappearing inhabitants. The last train there left at midnight, and Anton managed to buy a ticket at the last moment. When boarding was announced, he noticed an oddity. No one was walking to the carriage except him. The train looked old, with peeling paint and windows through which the light barely penetrated. But Anton decided that it was just ordinary transportation for such remote places. Stepping into the carriage, he found it almost empty. A few passengers sat silently with their heads down. Their faces were hidden in the shadows, and their movements seemed unnatural, as if they were merely present but not living. Anton took his seat by the window and took out his notebook to write down his first notes. But then something caught his attention. Through the glass he saw a man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform standing on the platform. He stared at him intently, as if considering whether to let him on the train. The doors closed with a loud creak, and the train started. "Your ticket," came a hoarse voice. Anton looked up and saw the conductor in front of him. His face was dead pale, and his eyes were deep, as if absorbing the light. "Yes, of course." Anton held out the ticket, trying not to show his surprise. The conductor silently took the ticket, studied it for a long time, and then looked up. "This is not just any train, young man. Not everyone makes it to the final station." Anton wanted to ask something, but the conductor had already left, leaving him with an inexplicable feeling of anxiety. Soon the train entered the tunnel, and the lights in the car flickered. Anton noticed that the passengers around him began to move, their heads slowly turning toward him. When the light went out completely, the carriage was filled with a strange sound, either whispers or a faint scraping. And then Anton felt a cold breath on his neck. Anton turned around, but saw no one. The cold breath disappeared, but the oppressive feeling of anxiety did not leave him. The lights in the car were still on, and the train continued to rush forward as if through an endless void. He looked at the other passengers, and his heart clenched. They were now sitting unnaturally straight, their heads turned toward him, but he couldn't see their faces. The darkness seemed to be thickening around their figures. "Excuse me, is everything all right?" Anton asked, addressing the nearest man. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed to the window. Anton did not immediately dare to look. When he turned his head, his breath caught. Outside the window, in total darkness, pale, ghostly faces flashed by. They moved with the train, as if floating in the air, and their empty eyes were staring straight at him. Anton abruptly moved away from the window, feeling fear gripping him. Suddenly the train began to slow down. The screeching of the brakes sounded like thunder in the middle of the night, and the carriage was filled with a strange rumble. Suddenly the lights flashed, and the carriage was illuminated with a bright, almost blinding glow. He could now see the passengers clearly. Their faces were distorted, some were missing eyes, others lips or even whole parts of their heads. All of them looked at him without blinking. The door of the carriage hissed open, and a figure appeared in the opening. It was the same conductor, but now his appearance was even more frightening. His face looked as if it had begun to rot, and in his hands he held a lantern, the light of which was a pale green. "Come out," he said, looking straight at Anton. "Where to? There's nothing here," Anton shouted, getting up from his seat. "This is the first stop. Those who stay don't come back," said the conductor with a grim note in his voice. Anton looked out the open door. Outside was an endless snowy plain, illuminated by the dim light of the moon. No trees, no buildings, just emptiness. "I'm not getting out," Anton said firmly, though his voice trembled. The conductor smiled, and that smile made his stomach clench. "Then the train will continue on its way, but you'll regret it yet." The door closed, and the lights went out again. This time the darkness was absolute, but Anton felt that he was no longer alone. There was a loud whisper behind him, as if many voices were speaking at once. "You have chosen your path." When the light came back on, the wagon had changed. The ceiling was covered with dark stains, as if from old, long-dried blood, and the windows were completely fogged up, not letting in a single ray of outside light. The air was heavy, and Anton found each breath difficult. He looked around at the passengers. Now they were no longer motionless. One of them, a woman in a long coat, rose from her seat and began to walk slowly down the aisle. Her movements were awkward, as if her body was a marionette and the puppeteer was pulling the strings. Anton instinctively stepped back. "Hey, are you all right?" he muttered, but her face remained lifeless. She stopped a few steps away from him, tilting her head so that her neck made a crunching sound. Then she whispered words that sounded like echoes. "They're waiting for you, outside the door." Anton wanted to ask who she meant, but her body suddenly collapsed to the floor as if there was no more life left in it. At that moment the train jerked again, picking up speed. Now the carriage was filled with sounds. Somewhere ahead someone was shouting. Somewhere behind there was the sound of footsteps. Anton realized that he was not alone in this strange space, but those who were around were not human. He looked at the door leading to the next carriage. It slowly opened with an eerie creak, and Anton saw that behind it was a thick fog. At first nothing could be seen, but then figures emerged from the mist. They were human-sized, but their bodies were elongated and covered with dark, charred skin. Instead of eyes, they had bright points of light that looked like headlights. "You must go through," came the voice of the conductor, who appeared behind Anton. "Pass where? What do you want from me?" he shouted, trying to keep away from the approaching figures. "This is the only way," said the conductor, and his face began to blur, becoming almost inhuman. Anton realized that he had no choice. Looking around one last time, he took a step into the fog. Outside the door, he felt the air grow even colder, and the sounds of the wagon disappeared. Silence surrounded him now, broken only by his own breathing. He walked forward, but the farther he went, the more it seemed to him that he was returning to the same place. Suddenly a mirror appeared before him. It stood right in the middle of the fog, reflecting not himself, but his fears. In the mirror he saw himself, but surrounded by ghosts, shadows of those who had boarded the train before him. "You are one of us," came a voice from the depths of the mirror. Anton raised his hand to touch the glass, but as soon as his fingers touched the cold surface, the mirror shattered, and he fell into the void. Anton woke up in complete darkness. The silence was deafening, as if everything around him had ceased to exist. His body seemed weightless, as if he was hanging in the void. "Where am I?" he mumbled, but his own voice sounded muffled, as if it came from far away, not from his throat. Suddenly, faint lights began to flicker around him. They flickered on and off as if they were stars, but each one was tied to a thin thread extending into infinity. The lights grew closer and closer, and Anton realized that they weren't just lights. They were scenes. Faces, images, situations flashed in each one. People boarding the train. He saw a woman shivering with cold, a man in military uniform, a crying child. Each light was someone's story, someone's life, cut short here in the void. "These are their destinies," said a familiar voice. Anton turned around and saw the conductor. This time he looked almost normal, but his eyes were still empty, lifeless. "What is this place? What's going on?" Anton asked, barely containing his fear. "It's a junction, a crossroads of destinies. Those who get here can never come back. Everyone who gets on the train brings with them fear, pain, or despair. The train draws them to finish what they started. But I haven't finished anything. I don't even know why I'm here." Anton clenched his fists, but his voice shook. The conductor smirked. "Are you sure? Take a look for yourself." He pointed to one of the lights, which suddenly grew and engulfed Anton. Anton found himself in a small apartment, familiar to the point of pain. He saw himself sitting at his computer. On the screen was an article about the missing village he was traveling to. "You chose this," the voice whispered. "You were looking for answers you weren't supposed to know." Suddenly the image changed. Now he saw a scene he couldn't explain. His parents, standing in a field, turn around and call out to him, but their faces are blurred. It's a memory he doesn't remember, but it triggers a strange pain in him. This train is more than just a track. It is your stop. Anton found himself in the void again, now fully aware that the train was not about a physical journey, but an inner one. This place demanded that he admit his mistakes and fears. "You can free yourself, but only if you accept the truth," the conductor pronounced. A door appeared in front of Anton, behind which a light could be seen, but with every second the light faded, and from the darkness began to appear figures, the same ones he had seen in the car. "Time is running out. The choice is yours." Anton stood in front of the door, behind which a faint light flickered. With each passing second this light was fading, and the figures from the darkness came closer and closer to him. Their eyes, like glowing coals, burned with terrible fire, and the whispers around them grew louder and louder, forming a single word: "Choose." Choose what? Anton shouted, clenching his fists. His voice trembled with fear and despair. I don't understand anything. The conductor appeared again, as if he had grown out of the darkness itself. He looked even darker now. His face was completely skinless, exposing bone, but his eyes still radiated a frightening calm. You have to decide, he said. You can stay here, among those who refuse to accept themselves, and become part of this void, or you can walk through the door, but the price is high. What price? Anton exhaled. The conductor smirked. You'll only find out there, beyond the threshold. Anton turned around. The shadows had almost reached him, their hands reaching out to grab him. The cold from their presence burned his skin, and he realized there was no more time to think. Gritting his teeth, he took a step toward the door and pushed it open. On the other side of the door, Anton found himself in a bright, blinding space. The light around him was so intense that his eyes began to water. When he was able to adjust, he realized he was in a room surrounded by mirrors. Each mirror showed different moments of his life. Here he was a child, hiding under the table, listening to his parents quarrel. Here he was a student, rejecting the offer of a friend who asked for help. Here he was an adult, burning a letter full of sincere words without daring to read it. These are all my mistakes, he whispered, feeling bitterness and regret clench his heart. Not only your mistakes, but also your fears, came the voice of the conductor, who was now standing right behind him. You have always avoided difficulty, run away from responsibility. This train has brought you here to make a choice, to keep running or to accept the truth about yourself. And what happens if I accept it? Anton struggled to utter the words, feeling a heaviness in his chest. The conductor pointed to the last mirror, in which nothing was reflected. If you enter this mirror, you will complete your journey. But remember, you will see not only yourself, but also what you left behind. Anton hesitated, but something inside him clicked. He realized that all this time he had been avoiding his past, his mistakes, his pain. If he refused now, he would remain in that oblivion forever. Gathering all his courage, he stepped into the empty mirror. Anton opened his eyes. He was back at the train station where he boarded the train. People around him were rushing somewhere. Announcements were playing on the loudspeakers, and the light of the street lamps was warm and ordinary. He looked at his hands. The ticket was gone. In its place he held a small, worn locket. Opening it, he saw a picture of his parents. He realized that this was his second chance. The train had given him a chance to go back and start over, but the memory of what he had experienced would stay with him forever. Anton took a deep breath and stepped into the new day, determined not to repeat his mistakes. Anton walked through the train station, trying to realize what had just happened. Everything around him looked as if the nightmare had been left behind. Bright lights, hurrying people, the smell of fresh coffee from the neighboring kiosk. Yet a strange feeling remained inside him. The locket in his hand seemed too real to be random, and the memories of the trip too vivid to be a dream. He decided to ask the cashier about the train he had supposedly boarded. "Excuse me," he began, walking up to the counter. "The train northbound that was leaving this night, has it arrived yet?" The cashier, an older woman with a kind but tired face, frowned. "The northbound train?" she interrogated. "Young man, the last train in that direction was canceled several years ago. The station in that place has been closed for a long time." Anton felt his heart freeze. "But, I rode it myself. The carriage was old." "The conductor," he began, but the woman shook her head. "Maybe you were dreaming, or maybe there's some mistake." She nodded at her watch. "Either way, you'd better get some rest. You look tired." Anton withdrew silently, but instead of relief, fear gripped him. He looked at the locket again. Inside, behind the glass, there was something new. In the corner of his parents' picture appeared the numbers, 12 o'clock. At the train station, the clock showed 11:45. Anton felt his surroundings change. The crowd of people moved too slowly, as if everything was happening in a thick fog. Voices were hushed and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty space. He turned around and saw a familiar figure. The conductor stood at the edge of the platform, his eyes glowing with a blank, cold light again. "Did you think this was the end?" He spoke, and his voice filled the entire station. "This train is not just your journey, it is the path of all." "But I passed the test. I have chosen," Anton shouted, clutching the medallion. The conductor smiled his scary grin. "The cycle never ends. You got a second chance, but you're not the only passenger." Anton looked behind the conductor and saw the train. It stood on the platform. The lights in its windows burned brightly, and the doors were open. Inside, he saw the silhouettes of the new passengers. "Who are they?" he asked, feeling everything inside clench. "Those who are looking for answers," the conductor replied, "and maybe next time you will come back again to complete your journey." The train gave a long horn, and Anton felt something pulling him back to the platform. Instead of running, he closed his eyes. "If this isn't the end, then I'll face him." When he opened his eyes, the train had already left, but the conductor's shadows still lingered on the platform, reminding him that every journey north is just the beginning of a new circle.